the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II, Charles I's son, had spent his exile in France. He was an admirer of the Sun King, Louis XIV, and he had French tastes. Therefore, when the monarchy was restored in 1660 and came back to England, he established a court devoted to pleasure. Theatres, racecourses, and taverns reopened, and fashion and gossip replaced religious debate. The reaction to the Civil War and Puritan Commonwealth varied from the rejection of strict morality to a more rational interest in the real, present world, rather than a concentration on the life of the soul. In 1662, Charles patronized the Royal Society, which was an association of scientists and intellectuals. The motto of the society, Nullius in Verba, on the word of no one, was a direct challenge to the dependence of the whole philosophy on authority. Among its members were the physicist and chemist Robert Boyle, the diarist John Evelyn, and Samuel Pepys, and the architect Sir Christopher Brand. As regards on policy, the landowners, both nobles and gentry, resumed their leadership of society, and the newly elected parliament, the so-called Cavalier Parliament, met in 1660. It ordered the bodies of the regicides, including Cromwell, to be exhumed and hanged. A series of acts were passed, like the Corporation Act, which excluded the dissenters from public offices. Then the Act of Uniformity, which imposed the use of the Book of Common Prayer, and the Tax Act, which required all public employees to conform to the Church of England. In 1665, there was a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, and in 1666, the Great Fire of London raged for 5 days, destroying 9/10 of the buildings within the city's medieval walls. Charles II asked the architect Sir Christopher Wren to rebuild the old and sanitary city. Wren presented a plan for the new city with wide streets and squares, buildings and churches in the neoclassical style. St. Paul's Cathedral was its masterpiece. Charles II was able to finance his project with the aid of France, who offered cash when the king's relationship with Parliament was difficult. In 1660, he signed the Treaty of Dover in preparation for a joint war against Holland. This treaty also contained a secret agreement that would restore Britain to Catholicism with the military aid of France. So when Charles died in 1685, the succession of a brother, James, who had converted to Catholicism, was assured. When James II came to the throne in 1685, he began to place Catholics in position of authority in the army and university. James was a widower, and his heirs were his 2 Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, who were married to the rulers of Holland and Denmark, respectively. James, however, then married the Catholic Mary of Modena, and in 1688 he became the father of a Catholic son, who took precedence over Mary as James' successor. The 2 opposing parties in Parliament, the Whigs and the Tories, were alarmed because another civil war could break out, so they began to negotiate with William of Orange, whose Protestant wife Mary, James II's daughter, was next in succession to the throne. In 1688, William of Orange marched across southern England, whilst James, his wife and son, fled to France. In January 1689, William and Mary became joint monarchs as William III and Mary II at the request of the Parliament. A revolution had taken place as the monarch had been chosen by Parliament, not by divine right. Because this revolution had succeeded without any fight, it was known that the bloodless and glorious revolution. During William and Mary's reign, acts were passed which set the course of parliamentary rule in Britain and paved the way to constitutional monarchy. The Toleration Act introduced more religious tolerance by granting freedom of worship to dissenting Protestant but excluded Catholics and Unitarians. Then, the Bill of Rights reenacted freedoms that have been started by Magna Carta and the Petition of Rights, and also it established that the king could levy taxes, raise an army, and suspend laws only with the parliamentary consent. Brianna Act asserted that Parliament should last for 3 years. Meanwhile, the exiled James II, supported by the Catholics in Ireland and Scotland, landed in Ireland in 1689 and tried to seize control over English who had settled there. In 1690, William defeated him in the Battle of the Boyne. In 1694, Mary died of smallpox. Since the couple had no children, Parliament passed the Act of the Settlement in 1701, which excluded Catholics from the throne and declared that Anne and their heirs would succeed William. Anne became queen when William died a year later. Anne was the popular queen, probably English and Anglican. She made important political decisions and even attended the debates in the House of Lords. In 1707, the Acts of Unions was passed by which the Kingdom of England and Scotland, established by James I, was replaced by the United Kingdom of Great Britain with a single parliament in Westminster. Ireland remained a separate kingdom with its own parliament, though subordinate to Westminster, with a Protestant government at Dublin Castle under a British-appointed Lord Lieutenant. In foreign policy, the Treaty of Utrecht was signed with France in 1713 at the end of War of the Spanish Succession, in which England was involved against France. It required the French to recognize the Protestant succession and expel the exiled Stuarts. It gave England the French possession in Canada and the monopoly of the slave trade with Spanish America. The British Empire was emerging. By 1714, British ships brought timber from America, sugar and tea from the West Indies, as well as Oriental carpets, Chinese porcelains, and spices from the Far East. English traders could send their goods around the British Isles free of custom duties, which made European goods more expensive. When Queen Anne died in 1714, George I, Elector of Hanover and James I's great-grandson, inherited 2 kingdoms and 12 colonies. But now let's see the early Hanoverians. The first Hanoverian was George I. 54-year-old George I spoke Layton English and spent most of his reign in Hanover, so he had to rely upon a cabinet, that is, the council of top ministers. The political scene of his reign was dominated by 2 opposing parties, the Whigs and the Tories. An ambitious Whig, Sir Robert Walpole, became the most powerful minister in a parliament. He is traditionally regarded as the first prime minister, and his anti-war government was to be the longest in English history. It lasted from 1721 to 1742. Walpole's military expenses, promoted trade, managed to reduce land taxes, and to restore trust in the established order, although he was accused of corruption by his opponents. He was awarded a town house in Downing Street that would become the official London's residence of the British Prime Minister. This period was considered as a golden age. Political debate extended to an intellectual elite. Corruption in politics and society was subject to the wit and satire of Daniel Defoe, Jonathan Swift, and William Hogarth. Liberal thought found expression in the philosophy of John Locke and George Berkeley. Coffee houses in town were places for social and professional networking and also for the discussion of ideas, as they circulated listed periodicals and pamphlets. The new middle classes enjoyed greater social mobility, whereas poverty and hunger drove people to commit petty crime and to drink gin. Young aristocrats went on a grand tour of Europe. Many returned with works of art that adorned their wealthy houses. Italian paladin style came to dominate British architecture with the beautiful example of Chiswick House on the Thames and Burlington House in Piccadilly. A religious movement, Methodism, was founded by John and Charles Wesley in 1729. It stressed respectability and moral dignity, the importance of living with temperance and method. The Methodists offer services to improve the life of the poor, such as Sunday school, where people studied the Bible, but more often learned to read and to write. Then George I died in Hanover in 1727 and was succeeded by his son George II. His reign lasted from 1727 to 1760. At the time, Spanish pirates damaged London's ocean trade, and the merchants asked Walpole to take action. He tried to negotiate with Spain in 1738, but war broke out in 1739. These drew Britain into a general European war, the War of the Austrian Succession, which lasted from 1740 to 1748. The War of the Austrian Succession was a conflict over territory between Austria and Prussia. Walpole was forced to resign in 1742, but the Whigs stayed in power. Then, in 1745, James Stuart's grandson, Charles Edward Stuart, known by his supporters as Bonnie Prince Charlie, raised a rebellion in Scotland to make his claim to the throne. He was called Jacobite because its aim was to restore the legitimate of James II, Jacobus in Latin. Charles was supported by a few Scottish clans and by France. The two armies met at the Battle of Culloden near Inverness in 1746. The Jacobites were defeated and Charles escaped to France, while most Jacobites were executed or sent to penal colonies overseas. The Commons supported a young, brilliant minister, William Pitt, who eventually became Prime Minister. So William Pitt became Prime Minister in 1756. Under Pitt, Britain's foreign policy was guided by mercantilism and aimed to maintain a favorable balance of power in Europe. The new middle class seeking its profits all over the world was reflected in the character of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. In 1756, war broke out, which lasted 7 years, and was called the 7 Years' War. And the 7-year wars lasted from 1756 to 1763. It was considered as the First World War because it was fought in 3 continents. The conflict had throughout in Europe between Britain and Prussia on one side and an alliance of France, Austria and others on the other side. Pitt sent a massive military expedition to North America in 1758 to fight against the French. Quebec was taken in 1759, and by 1760 the British controlled Montreal and most of Canada. The war also spread to India, where the British East India Company had set up posts in Calcutta, Bombay and Madras. In 1761, the British seized Podintry, and 2 years later, the war ended. George II died in 1760 and was succeeded by his grandson, George III.